So Julio, I'd love it if you could lay out your latest sense of the landscape of opportunity and limits when we think about capturing carbon and keeping it out of the atmosphere permanently going forward. There's the technical scale and economic and political landscape. Where are we at?
We have begun our global journey seriously now on carbon management. That comes in two forms. One is keeping CO2 out of the air and ocean. The second is pulling CO2 out of the air and ocean. And that breakdown has been clarified greatly by the recent IPCC reports, in particular the summary reports and Working Group 3 on mitigation. They recognize that to hit any substantial target, whether it is a 2030 target, a 2050 target, or the end of the century, you simply need a lot of carbon management. It is also made clear that that now includes both capturing CO2 from point sources, things like steel mills and power plants and cement kilns, as well as removal of CO2 from the air and oceans using many means, ranging from trees to direct air capture systems to biochar and everything in between. In part, this just reflects the harsh arithmetic of climate change. Now we see that we are just burning through the carbon budget, literally, and that means that we simply must do more to manage carbon dioxide directly. Building renewables is critically important, but simply not enough to get us where we need when we need to be there. This now looks like a couple of different things. Most importantly, still, CO2 capture on point sources. It turns out that we think about 70% of those will be in non-OECD countries. A lot of those will be in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, because that's where the emissions are, and that's where the emissions will come from. It is also true that the majority of those projects will not be on power systems. A lot of those will be on heavy industry, things like fertilizer plants, chemical facilities, and again, steel, cement, aluminum, these kinds of things. There has been a growing recognition among the science and climate community about how important the industrial emissions are. And some of those emissions can only be managed by carbon capture, most notably from cement kilns. We simply don't have another technology option to get that CO2. That CO2, just the byproduct of cement emissions, is a 3%. That's more than planes. That's more than ships. That's more than fertilizer. It's a lot. And so we just need that technology. Thankfully, the costs have already come down a lot. Over the past 10 years, the costs have dropped about 50%. That means that it's in the range of what politicians are now prepared to support in terms of incentives or mandates. We are also building out the infrastructure for CO2 storage. We've assessed where you can store CO2. It looks like we have about 10 to 20 trillion tons of capacity in general storage sites, mostly saline formations. These are places where there is not oil and gas, but will still hold CO2. And we now know that those systems can hold CO2 for many hundreds or thousands of years for sure. There's just no risk around that we do not understand. In looking at the split between industry and power, in places where we are building a lot of coal-fired power plants still, places like Southeast Asia or South Asia, it is the expectation that we will capture CO2 from some of those. Some of those plants will be shut down prematurely, but not all of them. And so for some of those plants, we're probably going to need to capture and store CO2. To do that will require a build out of infrastructure, CO2 storage sites, pipelines, these sorts of things. And in fact, some places, for example, near Mumbai and Ahmedabad, are well configured to store CO2. The same thing is true in places like Malaysia and Indonesia. We are also now, as I'd mentioned before, recognizing that we just need to remove CO2 from the air and oceans. Some of that will be done through a voluntary carbon market. And we see a number of initiatives growing around the world, including in Indonesia, where the voluntary carbon market can play a role in carbon management. Some of that may be done through reforestation or avoided deforestation, but a lot of it will be done with these novel technology pathways. And some of that will be done in soils, but some of that will be done with things like mineralization, direct air capture, or the production of bioenergy with carbon capture. And we are starting to see those projects appear. Part of the reason we're starting to see all those projects appear is that finally, after 20 long years in this arena, people can get paid. Some of that is in the context of, say, Europe, which has very high carbon prices and very severe carbon targets. They're using those severe carbon prices to pay for infrastructure developments like offshore storage and CO2 pipelines through the innovation funds or common infrastructure funds. In places like Canada, they're doing something quite similar. $170 carbon tax, also money for infrastructure, also some tax credits. And we're starting to see in the United States a mixture of mandates and tax credits as well. The most important of these is a tax credit that would pay you $85 a ton to just store CO2 alone. And at that price point, you get about 400 million tons a year of abatement. And there's an extra incentive up to $180 a ton for some of these engineered pathways. So that helps manage the price quite a lot. So as the costs have come down and the incentives have grown, we're seeing more. In that context, we are starting to see nations like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, Korea really pivot into this space. They are providing loans at good terms and good tenor. They're building the technologies that will do this, whether that is an autothermal reformer to make blue hydrogen, or whether that's a gasifier to gasify residuals from biomass waste and use that to store CO2. And when all of these technologies are coming forward in kind of this complicated way, I'm pleased to say that it looks like we're going to get what we need. That looks like something like 7%, might be as much as 12%, okay? But that's about the same size as EVs. That's about the same size as just wind. It's about the same size as building efficiencies. Like all of these other things are all about the same size. And so this is just one of the many things we need to do. And as a consequence, it needs to be supported and invested in at about the same level.
So one of the other factors that the safety, the question, the scale of this, how do you find, you might be able to find the geological deposits, but how do you find the political and insurance and other pathways so that people aren't afraid of having this too near them?
It is the case that carbon capture concentrates risk locally, and that's something you got to be serious about. Some communities will just have a hard time with that. And it may be that those are not communities where we deploy a lot. We are already seeing, though, the opposite effect as well. We are seeing some parts of the United States and Canada and Europe very much welcoming carbon capture. That includes places like Texas and Louisiana, the state of Wyoming and North Dakota, Alberta and Saskatchewan. They really want this technology and they're deploying it there now. Around the North Sea, you're seeing something similar. And I can imagine something similar happening in a place like Malaysia, which is very well configured to store CO2 near shore and offshore, where they then become an opportunity for another nation like Singapore to bring CO2 and store it in their place. We need enormous scale. To give you a sense, if we're going to capture 10% of emissions, that's 5 billion tons of CO2 a year. That's exactly the same size as the oil industry. Oil and gas industry moves about 5 billion tons of stuff a year. So you need an industry of that scale, and that is an enormous industry. The good news is that we are seeing almost every major energy company around the world, including Mobil, Saudi Aramco, Equinor, BP, Shell, Total, PetroChina, they're all pivoting into this business. Most of those companies I've named have created low carbon business ventures whose job it is to manage CO2 emissions. Most of those are starting with their own emissions, but they're moving into other sectors to provide that service. One of the things that's important to remember about carbon capture and carbon management in general is it's an environmental service. You're not making new products. You're just cleaning up. And so somebody has to pay for that. Somebody has to get paid to do that as well. And the oil companies see this as part of their opportunity set. Similarly, they see things like hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuels as part of their future, and they see carbon capture as a core technology element to that.
Great. And maybe briefly on direct air capture, which is a whole nother
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
frontier. Again, very tiny prototype-ish kind of scale right now.
Hmm.
Anything meaningful there you see?
Yep. We've begun to witness the birth of new species, specifically in the form of direct air capture technologies. There's now about 50 companies out there or more that will offer you something, but really only two or three large companies, only two or three projects around the world that have begun construction or are operating. Their volumes are quite small. The biggest one is operating in Iceland today that's 4,000 tons a year. For comparison, it's about 3 seconds of emissions. So it's not very much. But you can think about it as this is kind of where the solar industry was 15 or 20 years ago. The numbers were small, the prices were super high. Everybody said that will never scale, we'll never do it. And boom, you get a combination of market aligning policies and innovation and infrastructure build out, and then those things become possible. And we're starting to see the very beginnings of that with industries like direct air capture and CO2 removal. Again, the IPCC says we need a bunch of it. They expect we will need between 2 and 5 billion tons a year of removal using direct air capture. And that by the end of the century, maybe 4 or 500 billion tons would be
Yeah.
removed by direct air capture. If we know we need that industry, we better start building now. And
Yeah.
thankfully, we are.
And a last question, again, back in the aughts, in the 2005s, 2006, 2009, 2010, I was writing a lot about the lack of basic R&D funding, meaning pre-commercial and demonstration, RD and D. And it sounds like you might be saying we're sort of beyond that to a certain extent. With batteries, there's still some frontiers that are pretty daunting. Here, is it more really a question of deployment at scale as opposed to
So,
new ideas?
for things like capturing CO2 from a power plant or a steel mill, we have the companies and technologies to do that today. We can keep reducing costs through innovation, but mostly we're going to just reduce costs through deployment. And again, we already have dozens of companies that will do that, including Mitsubishi, Cansolv, Aker, GE, Siemens, companies you've heard of will do this for you. For things like direct air capture, there's a much longer innovation road to go,
Yeah.
actually. Here, we are still in the very early days. I will say, though, that we have begun to see an uptick of energy innovation investments of all kinds, and that's very much welcome. And things like the Department of Energy's Earthshot programs reflect that. The increase in funding in the US Congress, in the Japanese government, in the Saudi government, in the Indian government, we're starting to see now this growth of investment into the R&D because increasingly governments and their companies see this as a province of opportunity. They see carbon management as a future industry where they want to play. In the same way that they do with batteries, in the same way that they do with solar and wind, they see this as something where they can play a significant and differentiating role and grow their own economies.
Great. And there's one last, well, two more questions actually. So, and thank you again. Um, One is about materials, the
Mhm,
utilization part.
mhm.
Meaningful or always a niche?
Okay. So I want to make sure that your audience understands what you mean by materials. Many people think about critical materials when they hear the word materials. I want to be
Yeah.
clear, carbon management does not need any critical materials. It's all earth abundant materials, which is a plus.
Right.
What we are learning is that we can turn CO2 into other stuff. We've known that we could do that technically, but now it's starting to be commercially interesting. And the most interesting of that group is, in fact, building materials. In fact, you can turn CO2 into concrete, which is cool. You could turn CO2 into other building materials, which is cool. We use 30 billion tons of concrete every year. So you could probably get 1 or 2 billion tons of CO2 a year into that. That would be very helpful. And that concrete is, in fact, stronger and cheaper, which is good. We also are starting to realize that you can turn CO2 into things like chemicals and fuels. Here, it's much harder. Those will be nichey for a very long time because you need huge amounts of super low carbon energy for that to make sense. And I do mean huge amounts. um, but as the costs of renewable power drop, as the infrastructure for such things build out, I think we'll start seeing more and more of that. especially for things like the aviation sector. There are already companies, some of which we've invested in, that are turning CO2 into jet fuel and maritime fuels. That's awesome. That's exactly as it should be. And one of our companies sold 25 million gallons of sustainable aviation fuel to the Navy, and they did it with CO2 pulled from the air. So that's the kind of thing we're going to see more of.
That's great. And the last frontier is biological. Whether it's a trillion trees or
Mhm.
carbon management in soils. Um, there's lots of issues there, permanence, where we've seen forests go up in
Mhm.
flames recently, for example. That arena, it's a little bit off the technological side, but what do you think?
We are absolutely going to need everything that does carbon management. That includes the nature-based solutions. Um, I am well versed on the challenges of all the carbon removal pathways. Direct air capture is great, but it's very expensive and needs a bunch of clean energy. That's a challenge. Biomass with carbon capture is great, but that needs a lot of biomass. It has to be sustainably harvested, and that's a challenge, right? The same thing's true for things like reforestation. The same thing's true for soil carbon. They have their challenges. One challenge is permanence. There's risk of reversing the carbon and putting it back in the air and oceans. One of them is monitoring. It's actually hard to monitor soil and carbon. It's hard to monitor carbon in soils. And in fact, that's a real problem, putting that stuff into the voluntary carbon market today.
Yeah.
But we still know we need it. We need many, many billions of tons of all of that. And again, the IPCC is very clear that a large fraction of the CO2 removal will be done with nature based solutions. And that will continue to be the case. Today, the overwhelming majority of the voluntary carbon market is that stuff. While these other engineered systems grow, we will continue to plant trees and mangroves. We will continue to change agricultural practice, hopefully in ways that store carbon for a long time.
But this is great. You really put a lot into a short amount of time. So just finally, what's Carbon Direct?
I'm pleased to say that I am the chief scientist and chief carbon wrangler of the finest company on earth. That's Carbon Direct. For us, it's all carbon all the time. We do several things. One of them, we do advisory work. We help companies like Microsoft or pharmaceutical companies or banks or shipping firms figure out how to reduce their emissions and remove emissions. And in this, we focus really on what's the good stuff, just super high quality removals, super valid and durable reductions. We also have our own platform. If you want to go and buy 1,000 tons of CO2 removal, you can go on our site and do that. And it'll actually show you what your emissions are and give you ideas about how to reduce them. And whatever you can't reduce, there are ideas about what you might want to buy as removal. Um, we wanted from the very beginning to lead with science. Carbon Direct now is a little over 130 employees. About half of that is the science team. Because if you're going to get into this space, boy, you better understand the science and the engineering and the complexity and the technology. Because if not, you're probably going to make bad purchases or bad investments. We would rather you made good ones.
Great. Well, thanks again. As always, I've known you a long time, and I just always appreciate your insights, Julio Friedmann.